Hello and welcome back to the worst Warmachine channel on the internet. I'm Malorian, and this is Malorian Weekly. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is cross-faction models. We're going to be talking about what they are, what are the different factors that come into them existing at all in the game, and are they good for the game? So with that being said, let's go from the very beginning to what exactly are these? And they're pretty much exactly what they sound like. They are models that you can be taking in more than one faction. And I think one of the things to understand here is the idea of why you'd be having different factions, right? If you're coming into a game, you want to have different teams, because if all the teams are exactly the same, that's boring. You want choice to come in. You want the players to be like, I identify with this faction. Oh, I identify with this faction. This faction has this strength. This faction has this strength. So obviously, these factions are going to be different, have different strengths. In order to really show those different strengths, they're going to be having different models. So it makes sense that having like a Cygnar gun mage is going to be in Cygnar. And it makes sense that, you know, a Khador Juggernaut is going to be in Khador. But obviously, like what this whole video is about, is that there's cross-faction models. So these are models that can be in multiple different areas. Let's talk about the reasons why. And there's three. The first one I want to be talking about is going to be story, the fluff. Now, if we're thinking about the story that comes into making this game and the Iron Kingdoms behind it, sure, we have these different kingdoms, and when you talk about Cygnar, it makes a lot of sense for the gun mages to be as part of Cygnar. If we're talking about Kayazi assassins, well, yeah, those are going to be coming from Khador. But what about when we're talking about something like Savio Acosta? Somebody that kind of goes around trying to become the best fighter that they can be, traveling, fighting for whoever they can to try and pick up their skills and prove their skills. What team would you be putting them in? Well, I mean, like, you could make them Cygnar only, but that doesn't really fit right as part of a story. You know, what about something like the Steelhead Halberdiers? These are supposed to be mercenaries. These are supposed to be people that like, hey, you give me some coin and I'll come in and fight for you. And then once that's done, hey, I'm out of here unless you got more coin for me, because, hey, this is how I make my living, is going around being a mercenary. I'm a blade for hire. That's the way it works. So again, if you have something like that in the story, and a lot of stories will have these because mercenaries is a pretty standard idea to have in any fantasy world we're talking about, well then obviously it doesn't really make sense for them to be in just a single faction unless you had like a mercenary faction that only worked for themselves, so they're not really mercenaries. You see where I'm getting at here. So from a story reason, that's why you'd be having multi-faction, cross-faction models existing in your game. Here's the second part, though. The second part is going to be the rules-wise, the rules balance. Now, if I was the story writer for Privateer Press, I'd be focusing on that first one. If I'm a designer, I'm now going to be focusing on this part here. I want this game to be strong. Why would I want to be including mercenaries? I'm basically cross-faction models or mercenaries. I know it's not just the faction called mercenaries, but I'm just going to stick with that. So why would I want mercenaries in my game? Well, there's a couple of really good reasons. One is because if I am realizing every faction needs to have a cheap throwaway unit that's just supposed to get up there and die. I could be making garbage for every single faction, but what's really the use of that, right? I'm needing to make up all these slightly different rules. Probably the community is going to see it and say, like, what's the real difference? This is the cheap throwaway unit that everybody has, I guess. There'll be little complaints about like, oh, this is now getting all vanilla all the way across. Or I can make one unit like the Steelhead Halberdiers and be like, all right, this is that mercenary unit. You could be taking it all the way across. It's one unit. It's weaker because it's supposed to be these, you know, just standard mercenaries going around fighting for whoever you are. Boom, there you go. Or maybe I identify that in these factions, there's a gap. They don't have an answer to this. So why don't I make like a mercenary unit or solo that can be working for these two particular factions? And then while they're doing that, hey, you know, like there's no magical attacks that you could be giving out. Okay, now I'll make this solo that goes there and there. Great. That helps fill in that gap. Or maybe I'm trying to develop some play space in these factions. And it's like, you know what? They really push the shooting game, but they just can't really do it without a little bit more oomph. Okay, I'm going to make this solo, and then when it adds here, it's not so much a gap that I'm filling, but it's now strengthening what they had to now make this a viable strategy in those factions. So whereas before they might have been playing ABC, well, now D is a lot more viable to be played in that mix as well. So these are game design reasons that I would want to be having these inside of my game if I'm a developer at Privateer Press. So story person's happy because I have a story about these things and these solos that are supposed to be existing and fighting for multiple factions. And I say, great, let's find a way to make this work. Let's try and find a way to balance us all so that it's not just something that's going to explode it. In walks in number 3, which is the marketing person. And, you know, I it'd be nice if I could not talk about this, but I would be a bold-faced liar because this is absolutely another element, another force in this whole conversation. Because in this, as you know, this could be well-meaning between the story people and the rules people, and they're like, yeah, let's go and make this from the story. Yeah, we can add it like this, it'll work in great. The marketing people hear about this and go like, oh, we could do a lot with this, because this is what marketing cares about when they think about cross-faction models, mercenaries. Well, if I'm trying to sell something, if I'm not trying to sell my Signar, you know, Stormblades, who's going to buy it? Signar players, right? This is a unit that is specifically for this faction, so those people that play that faction are going to buy it. But what if there is a unit that works for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 factions? Who's going to buy it now? Well, all those people are now potential buyers for this product, and I'm just going to sell more of it because it's available to more people. So whether it is like in Warmachine, the way it's set up right now with like mercenaries and minions, where it could go as that type of a choice, be taken by multiple, or maybe it's something that goes in and being like, hey, it could be taken by these 2 factions, even though they're not really a mercenary. Whatever way I work it in rules wise, who cares? As a marketer, I'm happy because I'm selling the same product to 2 different people at the same time. And then the other thing to be thinking about there too is that once they're in, there's a higher likelihood that they're going to expand. You know, like if you think about one person owns one faction, the odds of them starting a second, or if they own 2, a third, or whatever you have at faction is X, right? I don't know what the likelihood is. Let's call it X. Well, if you already own a couple of models from that faction because they're these cross-faction models, your likelihood of now starting to buy into that goes up. It is now X plus whatever. So I've increased the likelihood that not only are you going to be buying these models because I'm selling the same product to multiple people, but now I've also increased the likelihood that you're going to buy a whole new faction. I mean, that's why I play Signar and Mercenaries, because there's a lot of mercenaries that work for Signar, and there's a lot of Signar stuff that can go into Mercenaries. That's why they always call it Merknar for so long, and especially in Mark II. It was the perfect thing. And so that's why I own all these, because they work so well together. And I've now have temptations other ways as well, right? I mean, now as I'm buying these different things, like Asphyxius 4, it's like, well, now I have some Convergence and some Cricks. Should I go and get some of that stuff? Like, once that is in there, there's a higher likelihood I'm going to be going that way. So we have 3 different forces trying to make us use these cross-faction models in our game. We have the story people saying, hey, it's in the story, let's make it happen. We have the rules people saying like, hey, I can actually use this to be shoring up some gaps, sharing out the options where I need it or making it so that other options are more viable. This is just another method for me to actually be putting in these rules that I need to do the balancing that I was trying to do regardless. And then you have the marketing people saying, yeah, let's go sell more stuff. So what are we trying to get from all this? Well, what we said was we want to say, is this good for the game? Is cross-faction models good for the game? And I think the way to look at this is it really depends where those forces are in alignment, right? If it really is the story people and the rules balance people, that's fantastic. You're going to be having something that's going to be working out great. However, if you're getting more of an influence from the marketing side, that's where you're really getting into trouble. I mean, like, I think for the most part, if you look at everything that's in Mercenaries, like, trust me, I'm a mercenary player. There's a lot of mercenaries. And I've heard some complaints about like, oh, well, once there's so many mercenaries, it's broken because if you can play mercenaries as a faction, oh boy, you have all these options. Don't worry, the game developers have very well controlled that by having very restrictive themes within Mercenaries that breaks things up. Plus, you can only take so much of all these different things. Plus, in a lot of cases, these models are weaker because they can be taken in all these different areas. And they have to be balanced for knowing that, oh, if it's taken in this faction, there'll be these magics and buffs and interactions and this and this and this. So in order to balance it from all of these, it has to be a tick down in the power level. So putting all these ticks down when you don't even have those things, yeah, it kind of works out for Mercenaries. But when you go and you push things too far, Asphyxious 4, then all of a sudden, that's where you're running into trouble. Because then once you have these models that not only work for other factions, but are up in the power and way up in the power, then you know that the marketing people, either the marketing people bossed their way in and said, we got to make some money, do this so we can sell a lot, or the rules people really drop the ball and the marketing people are just like over the moon, right? Like a thing like Archons that work in several different factions and themes, or Malvin and Mayhem that works in lots of different themes and factions, or Asphyxious that can work in those multiple ones. I mean, these things could easily be down like a lot of the other mercenaries. They are not. They are way up. And that is the problem. So I think, is it good for the game is really just a question of how it's executed. If it's executed like your typical mercenary, that, hey, this is just a weaker option that's available in all these different areas for these little like extra flavors you can be adding in here, no problem. That's fine. I play and see lots of different board games that have mercenary type elements, and it works out just great. It's no problem whatsoever. It is when you go and make these extremely powerful options that then that's what breaks it. Now, what a real challenge might be coming in here is, well, who cares? If there's 100 different options, it doesn't matter if 98 of them are fine if, you know, 2 of them are breaking the format. So do we just scrap everything so that we no longer have those 2? I don't think so. And I don't think so because the idea of those mercenaries are so important. I mean, we have to realize that what Privateer Press and other board game and tabletop war game producers are trying to do are trying to make competitive, profitable war games. And so in order to do that, they need to develop something where you could be entering in that balance and be pulling people in. And the idea that you'd have this method where you could be adding in this single option that's going to be, you know, filling in these gaps here, and then as well kind of like encouraging people to be buying into other factions, As a marketing person, that's just something that you need to do. Just like how, like as a game store, you probably have to sell Magic the Gathering because that's just a needed way you have to do things to make money and actually go out and do what you want to do with everything else. You're like, if you want to do 40K, you want to be doing Marvel, Crisis Protocol, whatever these other games are, that's all fine, but you probably still have to do Magic to be making money. Same thing here. Even though you're not giving in to the marketing side, you still need these types of cross-faction things to really develop it, encourage people so that you don't still be like, I'm a Signar player forever. Well, that's great. That means that, that's awful. But I mean, like being sarcastic, oh, great, you're not going to buy anything else now. All right, you might as well quit the game because you're not really buying much of anything anymore, right? As opposed to like, well, I'm a Signar player and hey, I got a lot of mercenaries. Why don't I become a mercenary player? Oh, now that I got all these mercenaries, I could very easily be a Menoth player. Like it just makes sense in the way you want it to work. As long as we're controlling that little tiny minority that's really breaking things. So I think so now my answer to that is it good? Yes. This is what we have to do then to mitigate those bad parts. We have to understand as a community what the benefits are to having cross-faction models in the game, and I just covered them, and we have to realize the dangers. And what that means is that whenever we are given the chance to give input for cross-faction models, we have to be in there demanding the power comes down. Because for things like Ephixius 4, hey, I gotta say, I as well was like, yeah, this is gonna be crazy. What's this? This is gonna be like an Archon that can get focus, and it's gonna be in my mercenaries. Wow, this is gonna be fantastic. Give it to me. And I fell into that temptation. When really, I should have been thinking more like, wait a second. This is going to be a super junior that can be taken in multiple different factions. Pump the brakes. We have to be bringing this power level down because not only should we make sure that the model is balanced for what its point cost is, but we should then take that and say like, this is balanced now? Okay, great. Because it's going across several factions, you just need to do that in order to make it fair in that way that opportunity cost kind of works into the cost of a model. So that's on us. We have to do our part as well. It'll be so tempting. All these, if there was a new model that came out tomorrow, and it's going to be, Striker 4, and it's like he came back as like the super undead model. It's like Striker can now work for Crix, and he's like still part of the forest, so Signar, I don't know, and Circle, like you could be saying whatever thing you want, and all those factions for the players would be like, oh wow, drooling, please give it to me, this sounds amazing. But as a community, we also have to realize that for this game to stay balanced, we need to bring that back down. And so I really do hope that the Privateer Press keeps up this whole CID process and allows us to have input into these things. I'm already looking at new things like Karchev, which we didn't have a lot of say into, and it is bonkers powerful. That needed to have more work into it. I've had podcasts on that. But those are the dangers that are going to crack open this game and make it so that it's not going to be enjoyable, because in this wide variety that we're supposed to be dealing with, if only certain things are ultra powerful and they're going to be taken by all those different factions that you can take those in. Well, we started this whole video saying that a game should be based on different factions with different strengths, but you don't have that. It's going to be, what is the flavor of Gaspy 4 that I'm going to be seeing today? And that's the real problem. So we have to do our part as gamers to try and push back against those whenever we have input. And then Privateer Press, if you're listening to this, when you have these 3 different people trying to have influence on this, realize that you're going to make more money at the end of the game, at the end of the day, if you have something that has intriguing story and balanced rules. And then naturally, we're going to buy things. You don't need marketing to push in there and be like, oh, make this super powerful and let's make a bunch of money right now. Because long term, that's where it's going to hurt it. So there you go. A little bit of a longer video, but there are some things here I had to really explain. If you agree, if you disagree, please put your comments down below. And otherwise, we'll catch you later. Bye.